watching FinFin News Network. I'll be your host today, Sibel. Protests broke out on Saturday during the Ethiopian festival of Irrecha, which is a Thanksgiving festival that attracts millions of people from all over Oromia. Oromos celebrate this festival typically early October every year, and it signifies the end of the dark and rainy summer season and also the transition to the bright and flowery fall season. Festival goers generally assemble in decorated cultural attires, and they praise their gods that help them to transition to this next bright season. And it typically brings millions to the capital and surrounding cities and celebrates the unity of the Oromo population. So Irrecha is attended not only by native Oromos, but also by other populations from around the country and even international tourists also. And in 2019, UNESCO recognized and registered Irrecha as an intangible cultural world heritage. Unfortunately, one of the reasons why protests broke out is because this festival often provokes some political tensions. For example, the Ethiopian government has used this festival, Irrecha, as an opportunity to lash out at the Oromo people. And unfortunately, there is a track record of the government using it as an excuse to attack attendants. So, for example, most notably, on October 2nd in 2016, the Ethiopian government deployed both helicopters and also ground troops and started firing on Irrecha attendants at Hora Arsadi, which is a lake around 38 miles from the capital. And this ended up killing over 700 Oromo attendants. And of course, because of that those historical atrocious actions by the government, many have also used this time specifically as a time to speak out about political oppression being experienced by the Oromo people. So the Irrecha in 2016, of course, was celebrated at the height of the Oromo Revolution, which is one of the reasons why this vicious attack occurred. The Oromo Revolution brought the Ethiopian government at the time to its knees, and the then prime minister was forced to resign. However, the revolution was actually hijacked by the regime currently in power, and the victories of the Oromo Revolution were reversed. So even though the Oromo people were allowed to celebrate the Irrecha festival in FinFin, otherwise known as Addis Ababa, in 2019, in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, the government prevented those traditional celebrations, blaming the spread of COVID-19. So this year, the official Irrecha festival was celebrated on October 3rd, but the eve before that day already attracted millions of very angry young Oromos who can be heard in some of this footage chanting demands to release Oromo political prisoners. Unfortunately, many Oromo leaders have been arrested with almost no reason, and we still don't know where they are or how they're doing. In fact, many of them went on hunger strike earlier this year. The government has not preserved transparency when it comes to the fate of these leaders that have been persecuted. So one of these demands that the protesters have been making this weekend is to release the Oromo army leader, or their allegiance. They are expressing their allegiance to the Oromo army leader, Jal Maro. So the government has, of course, in the past deployed very heavily armored vehicles and unleashed the current regime and expressing their displeasure with Abiy Ahmed and the persecution that he's continued on the Oromo people. So in the past, the government has deployed heavily armored vehicles to this protest and unleashed very vicious attacks on festival goers, previously killing 10 people and also injuring an unknown number of Oromo youth. And this is, of course, the same government that was responsible for the massacre of 2016. So most of the casualties that we are getting reports of right now are said to be treated in St. Paul Hospital in the capital, FinFin. And the current government and also the regional leader was part of this, was responsible for this, including the regional leader in 2016 when the worst massacre took place. So the end result totally disintegrated the ruling party. And only time, of course, will tell how this year's festival is going to affect this already very weakened and globally rejected regime. Some of the protesters were shouting things like "Down, down Abe," which is a reference to Prime Minister Abe Ahmed. And this was while they were performing, of course, the ritual ceremonies to mark this end of the season. So, we're seeing that this is, on the one hand, a very culturally significant festival, something that has a deep meaning to Oromo people, and something that is now being used by young people who are politically active to draw awareness to these incredibly heinous cases of the government persecuting many of its political rivals. So, for example, another opposition politician, Jawar Mohammed, was arrested last year following an outbreak of violence that was originally the result of the death of a very popular Oromo singer from the area. And Mohammed right now is still also behind bars. He's in jail along with others who were accused of terrorism, despite the government not having given a reason for what those charges are based upon, and not giving trials to many of these other politicians that have been persecuted. And these activists, of course, are claiming that the detention of these leaders is politically motivated. So, of course, these protests drew so many people, and in the chaos, there have been several deaths. However, we've also not heard really the truth from police spokespeople, and a question remains as to whether there were other casualties or what else really went on in this political clash that happened. So the Oromos have, of course, historically expressed frustration with this regime, indeed, ever since the beginning of the regime. Abe, of course, is the first Oromo leader of the country, but he faces growing criticism for his perceived persecution of this people. This comes in the midst of an ongoing conflict in the Tigray region. The government, other international agencies are investigating the fact that the government has essentially formed a blockade to that region. And so there are concerns of famine, and people know that there are war crimes basically going on in that region. The UN has reported on essentially weaponized sexual assault that women in that region have experienced. And so, these Oromo people are reacting to something that is a very long-standing persecution that they see. So last year, actually, hundreds and hundreds of people were arrested ahead of the protest on suspicion of either plotting attacks or causing unrest. And then, of course, this comes after the festival in 2016, when several dozen people were killed in a crush after police were firing both tear gas and also rubber bullets at these protesters. So there's a long-standing history of this going on. And in addition, so of course, as we know, this is an ongoing situation. And we can see here, this is some of the traditional celebrations going on. We can see people in their traditional garb. This festival draws large crowds of people, so there's a reason, of course, that that the protesters chose to make this the site of voicing their concerns with what's going on, of course. We can see people holding flags. And here we see that already some of the international community has been made aware of this movement. We see people chanting here. And we're hearing reports that this is primarily a movement led by young people. This is very much a youth-driven movement. The young people of the Oromo area have, of course, picked up the call and are now protesting against these perceived oppressions. Here we see other people in the street as the situation becomes more chaotic at the festival. Festival goers, of course, becoming eventually unruly in a way that is reflective of the 2016 circumstances. Many people remember the degree of violence that broke out back in 2016. And yes, here we see the very disproportionate, I would say, police response to these young people voicing their opposition. The police, of course, have come in with armored vehicles, and they've been known to fire tear gas and rubber bullets at these protesters. So obviously coming in with a very intense response here. So Abe now, of course, is set to be sworn in for a new 5-year term. And for many Oromos, this is, not something that they support, of course. And so part of this is making their displeasure known with the fact that he is going to be sworn in, and this leader who actually was previously, of course, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and that's not something that the Oromo people really might understand, considering what they have experienced under his regime. Many were chanting, of course, "Down, down, Abe." Many Oromo youth feeling as though this really has just continued. The carnage that we saw in the 2016 Irrecha festival has really not gone away. And this festival, which is very valuable to these people and very important to their culture, has now become sort of a source of continual violence that has been perpetrated by Ahmed's government. So in 2019, of course, that was a year after Abe took office, and he actually allowed a separate Irrecha celebration to take place for the first time in the capital of Addis Ababa, which was a move that really was very risky on his part, and many people criticized him for doing that, considering the cultural significance of this festival. He said that this was exacerbating ethnic tensions, and many people thought this was exacerbating these ethnic tensions, and many prominent Oromo nationalists have claimed that the capital actually really belongs to their people. However, that sort of set the precedent where now holding these two events in different places has become the norm. And of course, that was continued in 2020 when he actually said that he was not going to allow these celebrations to take place. And the rationale that he gave for that, of course, was the spread of COVID-19 that we saw last year. So many of these protesters that we see in the footage have really opted for a very overtly, intensely political message. Here we see them gathering together, speaking out against So here we're seeing the really intense anger of many of these people that are part of this group that basically has just, they have not gotten the recognition of what they are going through that they feel that they deserve. And, they are demanding more awareness towards this issue and towards a government that refuses to give their leaders political justice. Many of their leaders have not been seen. Some of them are on house arrest, and no one can come in and see what the conditions are like. Some of them are being held in unspecified conditions, and we don't know where they are or whether they've been given any kind of fair trial whatsoever. And so this is really an important issue going on in this right now, this country that really has been very much the subject of political turmoil, and it continues. Abe Ahmed, of course, has used an excuse of many outside either media networks or humanitarian organizations as, spreading misinformation. And so he kind of uses this to justify not allowing the channels of information to stay open so that protests like this can be seen by the rest of the world. Here we're seeing the gathered crowds together. Again, this is a festival that's very significant, and so the fact that it's become this site of political violence has been incredibly horrible for the Oromo people. Some people you can see even waving the flag of the Oromo Liberation Army in this group. Young people, of course, had also, a large part of the Oromo Liberation Army also was younger people, and so we're seeing this as definitely a political movement that is very much dominated by a younger group. So, of course, there were elections back in June, and the Prosperity Party won those by a very large amount, which was an outcome that many officials that are supportive of the Prime Minister Ahmed Abe have framed as sort of an explicit endorsement of his agenda. However, what we're seeing from these protests suggests that that's absolutely not universal throughout the country. And opposition parties, including, for example, the Oromo Liberation Front, have boycotted the polls and have complained that their candidates, of course, are being politically suppressed, not just for these reasons of them being jailed for essentially no reason, but also there are suspicions of potential election tampering, or I think that many have suspicions that perhaps these elections have not been held justly and fairly. And then, of course, more than 20% of the constituencies nationwide were contested only by the Prosperity Party back in these June elections. So these tensions are really coming at a time when right now we know that Abiy Ahmed is going to stay in power, and so we're seeing sort of a pushback against his official narrative that the elections that were held and that he won were kind of a mandate for his rule to continue. And these Oromo people are trying to stress that this absolutely is not a view that is held by everyone in the country. In fact, they're trying to push back on this narrative that he has sort of everything in control.
Oromiyaa lafuma oromummaan nafuma yaaduma qawweetumu dhumi jaanin dhumu barra waan qabu waliin qaba waan dhabu waliin dhaba kana yaantummaa qabu hin eeginaa hin cabu barra gaafa guulaa nu guulchisa gaafa duulaa nu duulchisa waan galgala abbaa eeggatu yoo beekkatan guyyaan beekkatu goonni diinaan girree bu'a gaafa xiiqii sabaaf du'a gaafa roorro ilmi dhiiraa gaafa xiiqii ilmi dhiiraa xiyyaara qabsoo keenya hayyootatu bararsee Capse mul'is gadaa Mustafa Harawee qabsoo sirbaa fi dhukaa sakawee eebbisaa busmaayoo hirmiin ba'ame bakka laaf jireenyaan iyyaan dhabame biddeen lafee daadhii baaburatti daaksifame ittoo foona caaluu hundeessattiin godhame hin nyaannu jiraan du'aan oodee nuti hima baafanna gumaa koodee walee normaas na ofi wal garre papachati amma wanje ture lamma shane fi abao o elle fi kafao imbarrena bartu oromoda martu te pama molite supu bialu tite keduda shaggarii fi dirree dhabuu waan hin jirre ifannee qulqulchuu alagaan hin bulchuu. Biyya kan keenya Oromiyaadha. Biyya kan keenya Oromiyaadha. Gaafa guulaa nu bulchisa, gaafa duulaa nu duulchisa. Waan galgala abbaa eeggatu yoo beekkatan guyyaan beekkatu. Goonni diinaan girree bu'a gaafa xiiqii sabaaf du'a. Gaafa roorro ilmi dhiiraa gaafa xiiqii ilmi dhiiraa. Namni Oromoo taatee qawwee ormaa baattee si gaafata seenaan yoo saba kee waraantee Mustafaa Huseen ta'ii ofiin beeki waraana baattee uummataan eegi badhoofgaa osoolee akeeka kaffaaloo miilatti dhabuu beeka abbaan gadaa beenuu bishaan mataa yaa'a dhaabata waliin laalaa sabaaf turreekaa. Diddan Oromoo manni lama beeka manneeni dhab mana kiraa deega kun dagala kun biyya ormaa keessa walitti qaba harka'ee wal keessa. Karrayyuu fi oboo maatii torba sabbuu eegii hulaa weerartuu orgobbaa diinagdee nu cabsu soodaree rammasu hayyuu keenya hidhaa hin barbaannu cidhaa. Taaddeedhaa meedura amantiin hafuura waliin nyaannu didaa tokkummaa waa fidaa. Nadhii nyaannu gurra gabrummaa xumurra hin qabnu qulqulchuu alagaan nu bulchuu. Nu Oromoodha warra lubaati. Nu Oromoodha warra lubaati.
So what you saw right there was some footage of just some snippets of cultural traditions that have been preserved by the Oromo people. Of course, this is a country with many different minorities, and Oromo is only one of them. But of course, this is very significant considering that Abiy Ahmed, of course, the first Oromo leader of this country. And of course, those political struggles have increased over the last years after this group has experienced so much persecution. And so we're just trying to, spread awareness about these traditions and sort of give a little look into this culture that unfortunately has been somewhat obscured by the political violence that has often accompanied many of these traditions. So, for example, many of these, the protests in Ethiopia have a sort of long lineage through the past years, at least, during Abiy's reign. So many people, of course, would make the shackle symbol. The shackle symbol with their hands held above their head was originally made famous at the Rio Olympics when the marathon runner Feyisa Lilesa raised his arms in that manner over his head. And so that sort of has also become a symbol of the persecution felt by these people. Many Oromos, I think, feel as though they are sort of second-class citizens in their own country, and they've been made to feel pushed to the sidelines, especially as this political struggle continues. So although most of them live in the Oromia region, the country is divided into these different ethnic states. And of course, Addis Ababa, the capital, is surrounded completely by Oromia. And some Oromos say that it was even frowned upon for them to speak their own language in public around the capital. And of course, this has sort of been concentrated in the what's called the alphabet generation. It translates to alphabet from the Oromo language, which is a reference to those people who were for the very first time actually able to be educated in their own native language, which was a policy that was actually introduced to schools in the 90s. And so this is, again, a movement centering upon a younger generation. So there's sort of a political statement that is embedded within this. That points specifically to a decision for that native language to adopt the Latin alphabet, which sort of distanced itself from the working language of the country and created this divide. And so, of course, some of what these protests have also centered on is supporting the Oromo opposition politician Jawar Mohammed. This was one of the earlier cases of the start of the political persecution that we've seen continuing. He was arrested last year after an outbreak of violence that was sparked by the death of an Oromo singer that was very popular in the region. And many in this region still support him and are basically raising the alarm to try to see how he is. And you know, they're not happy with how these political leaders have been treated by the current regime. So that will be the end of our report for today. Thanks for tuning in to FNN News Network, and I am your host, Sibel.